everybody, what is going on? We have a little bit of a shorter video than usual today. I wanted to share my most recent strategy for keeping up with the draft meta, keeping up with winning as much as you can as the format goes on, and that's leaning a little bit more into multicolored decks in Phyrexia. So I'm going to dive a little bit into how I got to this point in the format in a second, but I want to just put this video out there because I've had a lot of people recently come to me and say, hey Alex, I was doing well, or at least decently for the first few weeks of the format, just happily drafting red green and white red, and just those good decks that maybe were underdrafted for a little bit. But in the past week, those decks are tougher to come by. The card quality is just not quite there. People are fighting over those decks more, and I'm not sure what to do about it. I felt that way for a while, and that's kind of how I got to this point in the format. So if that sounds like your experience, this might be a good video for you. So yeah, buckle in. I'm going to show you some examples of the decks that I've been drafting and having success with, and just things to prioritize when you're drafting 3, 4, 5 color decks in this format. Okay, so like I said, I do want to quickly just look at how I got to this point in the format quickly. For those keeping up with the format, you'll know that green-red and white-red, some of the top decks, and I've got a green-red deck here that looks solid. It looks pretty good, but it's not quite the quality of a green-red deck you'd get 2 or 3 weeks ago when the deck was really, really dominating. We've got a few too many filler cards that I would prefer not to play. I've got like a Furnace Skullbomb in here. We've got like 3 Axiom Engravers, where maybe I'd prefer some more aggressive 2-drop, some Batter Fists, or some better uncommons or something like that. The 3-drop slot, it's pretty good. We got 2 Punishers, a Vorak Contaminator, and it's like, 2 Blasts, where maybe I'd prefer like 1, and maybe just a few more things down here, basically. So a solid deck. But I found with these kind of decks, I've been getting like 3 and 4 wins in Mythic, where, I think that I'm not really getting an edge, because everybody's deck is about this power level, where it's like, yeah, it's good colors and it's good cards. And, gameplay does go a long way in having 2 similarly powered decks and winning in those matchups, but I feel like I wasn't getting a deck building edge. And when I'm drafting and really taking advantage of the draft meta, I really want to get a deck building edge and make use of cards that people aren't picking up on. Here's another example. Here's a red-white deck. It looks pretty solid. It's got double Basilica Shepherd. It's got a Koth. It's got like a good number of 2s. But again, it's kind of playing some things I just would kind of prefer not to play. Double Blade Graph Aspirant, the Sinew Dancer in a deck that can't poison the opponent that easily. What I'm finding in a lot of these decks, and I'm sure a lot of you are experiencing this too, is that your cards 1 to like 18 or 17 are pretty good. It's just good cards, B level, B minus level cards. But then cards like 19 to 23 or 24, kind of crappy. And that's what I'm trying to avoid with drafting multicolor stuff. And you'll actually find in any format, things do start to branch out into multicolor as the format goes on. Because at least what I find in my experience is that it's just hard to get a good 2-color deck consistently. And not saying you're going to splash every single time, but when you feel that maybe a given color is not open in your draft, or you're feeling there's no one color that's pulling you in a certain direction, you're like, hey, I can latch onto white because I know it's going to be open. It's kind of just hard to read the most open color. It does help to kind of branch out to other colors so that you can get 23 awesome spells in your deck and not have to sometimes draw Blade Graph Aspirant where it's not so great. And so that brought me to a point in the format where I just went, I'm kind of tired of having my last 5 cards being crappy. Why don't we just draft in a way that we can have as many good cards as possible? And that's where prioritizing fixing comes in. And generally these decks, they can be any color, honestly. They're least often blue, because if I'm trying to get, just like all good cards in my deck, the blue cards don't offer that so much. But any combination of red, green, black, and white, I found that to be a pretty good way to get into a deck like this. And, most of your cards are going to be, I won't say defensive in mind, but they do get on board early and they help you block against the other aggressive decks, while then transitioning into a plan of valuing your opponent out with like Cruel Grimnarks or just like Battle Chair, or, I'm splashing Indoctrination Attendant, which looks kind of funny, but it's a pretty good way to ground out some value if you've got a Battle Chair or just any of the Formarian equipments or good ETB effects. And this deck in particular, it's got quite a few fixing tools, Prophetic Prism, it's got Thirsting Roots, got a bunch of rare lands that I was lucky enough to pick up late, Terramorphic Expanse, and it means that, you've got enough sources for 3, 4, 5 good splash cards. And this is like a pretty tame example. I'm splashing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And as you can see, lining up with my previous statement, I'm splashing 5 cards, right? The 2 Grimdarks, the 2 Attendants, and Chart Forgers. Just, pretty good cards, value-generating cards. And that makes up for those 5 cards that might have not been so good. Might have been a Blade Graph Aspirant, or, the second or third Hazardous Blast that maybe I only wanted 1 in my deck. So it's just, these splash cards are exactly filling that role of getting to 23 awesome cards in my deck. And, anytime you're splashing or have a multicolor deck, you do still have to respect that there's going to be aggro decks, and in this format especially, you're going to face really fast decks. That's fine, though. As long as you've got good, cheap stuff yourself, you can support this long game value plan. The trick, like I've said in some of my previous videos, is you just got to make sure you've got your turns 1, 2, 3 lined up, and then you can have a little bit of breathing room to grind out some value or kill your opponent with some bigger stuff. By the way, these 3 decks I'm showing you, these are my last 3 trophy decks that I've drafted over this past weekend. So this isn't just like, theory. This has actually been put into practice, and this has been pretty successful for me. It's kind of why I wanted to make a video, because it's all I've been winning with this weekend. Again, here's another example. Green-red base, splashing about 5 cards off of, 1, 2, 3, 4, Vorax, if you want to count that as a cheeky source. Axiom Engraver, cards like this that help you filter your cards, so you're finding the right cards, finding your mana, ditching a splash card when you can't cast it, right? Just, my decks are looking a lot like this lately. Here's my final example, a little bit of a different take, a black-red control base with a bunch of slashes, some good cheap interaction, and just splashing 2 white cards and a Ravager. So not splashing as many cards as in the other deck, but it's the same idea, right? All of my cards are good, and instead of having to play like kind of crappy 20 to 23rd cards, you pick up some fixings so that you can play these cards. And this is not a revolutionary idea by any means. I'm not trying to say like, look, splashing is this cool thing, but I do think that splashing multiple colors and multiple cards, like 3 or 4 cards, is slightly atypical, especially for this format. But, and here's the thing, now that the format has slowed down a little bit, and people aren't coming to the table with just like busted red decks that they got all the good cards at their table. Those cards are contested a little bit. One, like I mentioned, it's harder to get together good playables, 23 good playables, but also other people are going to have decks that look like the ones I showed you before, that red-green deck that was just a little bit underwhelming, that white-red deck that maybe was missing a few pieces. And so you can actually capitalize on that by grinding them out, because if they're going to run out of steam a little bit quicker because, their cards aren't as potent, well, it leaves some opportunity on the table for you to take advantage of these more expensive grindy value cards. And that's, I think, where I want to be in this format right now. Just making use of the good expensive cards, because people are coming to the table with a million awesome 1, 2, and 3 drops. So you've kind of got an idea of what the decks look like, and I'm going into most of my drafts assuming I will be splashing something by the end of them. I mean, if the lane, like a red-green lane or a white-black lane, whatever it is truly open, great. I won't have to. But I do, pretty early on, start prioritizing Terramorphic Expanses and Dune Mover over decent filler, right? I'm not taking these cards first, second, third pick, but I'll take them out of weak packs. I'll take them over like sea-level playables in my color. One of the nice things about fixing in this format is that because other people, at least right now, are generally playing 2 colors, you can get these cards relatively late. Like, I wouldn't consider, trying to wheel all of the fixing, because some people do pick it up, but we are in a point in the format where it's not like Dominaria United, where people were third picking dual lands and stuff, right? These lands go pretty late because not a lot of people want them. So let's just jump into the best of the best fixing tools. The ones I have on screen here are the best. Number 1, Armored Scrapgorger. Fixes for 5 colors. That's a really, really big deal. Anything that can fix for 5 colors is great, because you don't have to worry about fiddling with what land to go get with your Terramorphic Expanse. You don't have to worry about, oh crap, this fixes for blue, but not for black. And of course, Scrapgorge is just a fantastic card. Turning into a 3/3 is good. Past that, I want Dune Mover and Mirror Convert. Those kind of are sort of proxies. Dune Mover does a good enough job of getting the land you need. And then the lands. The lands are pretty good too. Terramorphic Expanse, the rare lands if you can get them. Seed Core is pretty solid. Although I will warn about Seed Core. Sometimes you are splashing like removal spells or equipment, like the red-white uncommon equipment that doesn't actually help cast it. So just be aware that this is not a 5-color fixer for all the cards you might want to splash. And the reason that these are the best tools for fixing, as opposed to something like, Phyrexian Atlas or Prophetic Prism, which I'm going to get to in a second, is that they're not tempo negative, right? You can block with your Doom Mover. If you need to block with your Mirror Convert, you can do so, right? It's not like you're like, all right, taking turn 2, setting up my fixing. Like I mentioned, you do still need to block against the aggressive decks, and these help you do that if you do need to, or they help you fix if that's what you need to do as well. So yeah, to put a button on these, Scrapgorger, you should just take this card early. It's fantastic all the time. These other cards, I'd be pretty happy taking them around like 3rd, 4th, 5th pick. Again, I'm going into drafts assuming I will be splashing something, so it's not like, ooh, Convert's good, like, if I am splashing. And if I don't end up doing that, well, that means there's a fantastic deck in my seat that I didn't feel like I needed to splash. The goal with all of this, once again, I want to reiterate, I'm trying to have all of my cards in my deck be good cards and not need to play filler cards. Some other fixing tools, Thirsting Roots. I just want to mention Thirsting Roots because it's sort of like an Evolving Wilds, right? It's a 1 mana, quote unquote, just like Evolving Wilds, takes 1 of your mana for the turn, goes and gets a land of any color. This is about as good as an Evolving Wilds, or sorry, Terramorphic Expanse in a green deck, but you do need to make sure you've got like 9 or 8 green sources so you can consistently cast this. I'll replace the first land with a Thirsting Roots almost every single time, so 16 lands and a Thirsting Roots. Sometimes I'll replace the second if my deck is particularly low curve, but you do want to make sure that, you can hit that first land, and you want to make sure that you're not drawing a hand of Thirsting Roots and, like, no lands in your opening hand. As long as you have 1 green source in your opening hand, this does kind of function as a Terramorphic Expanse, though. Contagious Vorak, another card that not quite fixing you for as 1-to-1, but helps you find your sources a bit more often. The card is just good, but I just wanted to point out the more Voraks you have, the more kind of creative, should we say, you can get with your mana. And then Prophetic Prism. Prophetic Prism is a card that I've definitely come up on a little bit. I don't think it's the prime way I want to be fixing, but if you'll notice, I actually had one in one of the decks I showed you. And the cool thing that Prophetic Prism does is it gets picked up by Indoctrination Attendant, which is the white 3/4 toxic one that you can pick up a permanent. I do like that. That's a good way to generate value. It also, for if you have anything that cares about artifacts, it goes up a little bit. Again, this is kind of like the second tier fixing, though. And then we get to Phyrexian Atlas, which I don't even have here, but it's the 3 mana rock. That's a card I only want to play if I don't have better options, or maybe I'm like, I have a bunch of 5-drops and it's a little more acceptable to take turn 3 off to play a 5-drop. So don't consider that something that you're going to be speculating on just like you would with these kind of cards. Phyrexian Atlas is more of like all right, last resort. I hope not to play it. And then, of course, well, what are your good splashes? Okay, well, rares, obviously, are great. And stuff like Glissa, Sunslayer, Kaito, Dancing Shadow, really good cards to splash because base green-black and base blue-black are not fantastic decks on their own, but, I'm pretty comfortable first picking a Glissa or a Kaito and just being like, hey, it's going to get into my deck somehow. I have a red-green deck? Great, I'm going to splash the Glissa. Or my black-red deck? Great, I splash the Kaito. Atraxa is just one of the best cards you can open for this strategy. It's a card that, it's a mythic, but you actually get this passed a decent amount of the time because, not a lot of people can cast a green, white, blue, black card. So I've definitely gotten this card passed to me when I've been drafting this kind of deck and been like, yeah, awesome. I just get to nab this A+ card in my deck. And it is an A+ card if you can cast it. That's just the restriction of, being able to put that amount of mana in your deck. And in these decks, if you're prioritizing those 5-color fixing tools, like I mentioned, it's not that hard, really, especially if you've got a ramp tool like the Scrap Gorge or casting us in turn 6, like it's just game over so much of the time. But past rares, there's also just a lot of good cards that are uncommon that I'm looking to splash. Cinderlash Ravager and Bladehold Warwhip. Those are just fantastic cards. Cards that you are going to pick early, or sometimes you get them past you if you're lucky. Charforger is one I want to call out as not quite as good as these other 2 cards, but you get this card really quite late. And I often note this card being in the packs early on. Like, let's say there's a good red removal spell, a Hex Gold Slash, and I'll probably take that over Charforger because, I don't know exactly where I'm going to end up. I don't know if I'm going to be splashing black or red, and this is a card that does tend to wheel a lot of the time. And just noting it and saying, hey, that was in the pack, I should pick up some fixing because I think this card's going to come back because Charforger, black-red is not a common deck. People don't draft this very often. So this is a card that you get for free a lot of the time, just kind of like Atraxa, because people aren't able to play this card, so they just don't pick it as often. And then, the premium removal spells like Rebel Salvo, Ossification, these are also pretty good splashes. If you're getting to the territory of double splashes, like white, green, I would really only double splash for 3 cards in this set. And those are the Eternal Wanderer, White Sun's Twilight, and Nissa. And when you're double splashing, the number you want to get to in your deck is like 8 sources, which is difficult. That means you need a lot of multicolor sources in your, green-red deck, let's say, to splash the Wanderer. But it's possible, and I've done it before. You just need to make sure you've got, 2 Terramorphic Expanses, a Dune Mover, a Prophetic Prism, probably 2 Planes in there, probably running 18 lands. So it's doable. But if you're putting in all that work to splash a card, you really have to make sure that you're going to win the game an overwhelming percentage of the time when that card actually resolves. And I think these are the 3 cards that I would classify as good enough to put the work in, get those 8 sources in, splash these cards. I want to quickly touch on what each color brings to the table for these decks, especially at common. So red, kind of funny enough, is like the best control color in this format, or one of the best control colors. Its cards are pretty good at attacking, but they're also pretty good at defending. They're good at playing both ways, and that's why red is so good in this format. This is probably the best place for Axiom Engraver. You know, in your green-red decks, I like Axiom Engraver, but you don't want to have too many of them, because you do want a good amount of power and toughness on the board to start attacking, because that is mostly a beatdown deck, but being a 1/3 body that, you know, you've got your oil synergies in these decks, these multicolor decks sometimes, but also just like filtering you, blocking early, really, really great place for it. Hex Gold Slash, super important. I do think you want to get like 4, 5, 6 removal spells in your deck if you can. And that's not that hard because you get to pull from all the best removal spells of every color, right? So Hex Gold Slash is not a card that I'm going to splash like all the time. Let's just say in like a black-green version of this deck. But it's a card I could consider. You know, it does hit enough stuff that it's not like a removal spell or normal shock where it's like, oh, it's 2 damage. What's it going to hit in the late game? The 4 damage does hit enough stuff that, well, it's not like a catch-all removal spell that I can kill everything with. It does a good enough job that I would consider splashing it some amount of the time. And it is very, very important if you are just like base red, prioritize this card. It's just so important for staying alive. Chimney Rabble, really good both at attacking and defending. Not a surprise for anybody who's played this format. Chimney Rabble is awesome. Actually, I should probably say it might be a surprise if you're watching this video, because this card still goes pretty late. This is like top 3 commons in the set. It's excellent. It just does everything so well. I know it reads unexciting, but it blocks, it attacks, it, multiple bodies for one card is quite good. So prioritize this card as well. And then Furnace Strider. Furnace Strider blocks really, really well. It turns the corner really, really well. One of the things in these decks is you're not like grinding out infinite value. It's not like, oh, I'm just grinding my opponent to dust. You do want to turn the corner pretty quickly if you can, right? You don't want to lose to an opposing bomb. You want the game to end rather than go on for 12 turns and have your opponent draw a bomb of their own, right? So Furnace Strider maybe looks a little bit out of place potentially, but is just really good as a blocker and for turning the corner. Black, I want to call out as, the removal spells are pretty good. Anointed Affliction, Annihilating Glare. Specifically with Annihilating Glare, you do get to do the sack your Prophetic Prism and cast Glare for 1 mana, a good amount. That's another nice thing I could say about Prophetic Prism. But Cruel Grimnarch and Testament Bearer, I do want to call these cards out because they are, I would say, underrated. I think that they're not particularly synergistic. They don't have anything to do with Toxic or Oil, but they are really good at grinding out a game. Like Testament Bearer, when this comes down, your opponent doesn't want to attack into it very often. It also attacks pretty well. Your opponent doesn't want to block it. Cruel Grimnarch, I've chained these multiple times. Just been like, Grimnarch into Grimnarch, buy back my Grimnarch. And that just grinds your opponent out of the game so much of the time. So keep your eye out for these cards. They do tend to go kind of late, which is nice. Just like good cards for the deck that go kind of late. You often get them on the wheel. So, typical what you would expect from black removal spells. And I did specifically want to call out these 2 creatures because I know they're not on everybody's radar. Green gives you Rustvine Cultivator, Oil Gorger Troll, and Contagious Vorak. Rustvine Cultivator in particular is a priority because it really does help you catch up from behind or get into a spot where you're not actually ever behind if you can have this early in the game. Especially because so many of the good cards are at 4 and 5 mana. I've just found that making sure that you can cast your Chimney Rabble on turn 3, or casting even just like a Lattice Blade Mantis, right? The 4/3 with oil that untaps. You can untap it when it attacks and give it +1/+1 by removing an oil counter. Like, just getting ahead of the curve there really means that the aggro decks have a hard time getting under you. So I will happily play 2 or 3 of these. This is another reason to cut a land. If you've got 2 of them, I'd say you can cut a land at that point too. Oil Gorger Troll is another one that I want to call out, as I think a lot of people have been on a roller coaster with this card. Went from like, ooh, this card's pretty good, to, oh, I realize that in my red-green decks, I don't really want this card because it doesn't attack all that well. It's just a 3-power, 5-mana creature. But if you're slowing down the game, grinding out value, it goes back to being a great card. And of course, Contagious Vorak, like I mentioned, always going to be good. For white, there's not a ton of reasons to play white. I found that these decks generally are like Jund base, green, red, black, but Ossification, always going to be good interactive spell. Indoctrination Attendant, called that out. It's been a card that I have been happy to splash, picking up your for Mirrodin equipment and value creatures. So white's not going to offer as much. A lot of its cards are more aggro focused, but these are some standouts. And then blue, like I mentioned, blue is not a color you end up with all that often in these decks, just because Like I said, the name of the game is play all your good cards, and blue doesn't have a ton of those, but Immobilizer is a pretty good generic card that I've definitely, splashed and been pretty happy to do so. And just to close it out here, I want to give a draft walkthrough just quickly of one of the decks that I showed. I'm not going to go pick for pick talking my in-depth thoughts on each pick, so if you did want me to go a little bit more in-depth on any individual pick, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to respond. But just to skim through this, to just kind of give you an idea of how the flow of these kind of drafts goes. So I start with an Archfiend, just the best card here. Once again, just Plan of Disruption, just take the best card in the pack. I'm not sure what my base 2 colors are going to be, so might as well just cherry pick the best cards from each pack and figure that out as the draft goes on. Here I take a Barb Batterfist, noting that Charforger, and noting the Dune Mover too, but Batterfist is good enough in a monocolored card. As much as I was saying, I'm expecting to play a few colors here, I do think that it's still good to lock in good monocolored playables when you can, especially 2-drops when you can, and Batterfist is just quite a good card. Here I take Mantis. Notably, there's a retrofitter here. If somebody wants to be blue-white, that's totally fine, but that demands a lot of you. It demands just having to take basically all artifacts, and it's just kind of inflexible for what this deck is trying to do, right? It's a card that I've considered putting in my deck before, even in these kind of decks, but the idea of these decks when you're drafting them a lot of the time is I just get to play the best cards I see out of every pack. And when you have Retrofitter in your deck, well, that demands that you put some kind of junkier artifacts in, and it's just not really going to mesh with the strategy here. We got a Charforger here, which is kind of nice. We get, just the end of the pack here, taking the good cards. We get an Engraver, which is cool. Prophetic Prism is a nice pickup here with some, I'm aiming for 5 or 6 sources of multicolor fixing, and having that as one of them is fine, even though it's not, one of the better ones like I mentioned. And we wheel some pretty good cards, and we wheel that Charforger. So, I've just got a lot of good cards, and at this point, I'm just going to try to find my base of 2 colors. Maybe it's a red base, maybe it's a black base. We'll figure that out as the draft goes on. So, I'm just going to skim through this part of the pack here, pack 2 and pack 3. I take a Batterfist, and now that I've got kind of a bunch of good cards in a bunch of different colors, I am trying to look for a base of 1 or 2 colors. Ideally, or likely, it's going to be red, because red's just pretty deep, and it's also got a lot of those good tools to help you in this deck like I was talking about. I get a Cultivator here, which is another good pickup, because I do have some expensive stuff here. Very lucky, I get a Dragon Wing Glider, get a Cinderlash Ravager too, pick up an Edifice, because remember, I could still be black here. Red, black, or red, green is my base. I think either of them is possible. I do have that Archfiend. Medium cards as we go on, yet another Charforger, sweetening the pot for red, black. Halberd, good card. I pick up my first white card here, which is kind of interesting, but, I'm optimistic. I also don't care too much about anything in this pack. Ruthless Predation is a good card, but War Whip is enough better. There's also Hazardous Blast that I should note is a lot worse in these kind of decks than it would be in a typical red-green deck, because you're just not looking to go 1, 2, 3, attack you, curve out, kill you. So, not off, a little bit too infrequently, this card is going to do what you want to do in this style of deck. It's still a fun card if you had to play it, but nowhere near a priority like it would be in a different style of deck. Here we take a land, which is nice, passing up on a Rabble and Ossification, but that's okay, because we do get to play, this helps us play our other good cards. Pick up another War Whip, pick up a Vorak, Incubation Sac, another good way to grind. This Terramorphic Expanse, really, really key as well. And, another piece of fixing over some good playables, because I did feel like I needed to lock in that fixing at that point. Really, really like Chimney Rabble, too. This is actually kind of interesting. I ended up taking a Cultivator over a Chimney Rabble, even though I love this card, because I did feel like, getting this stuff out a little bit earlier, I had enough top end, basically, is what my thought was, especially with these Charforgers. I'm not going to be short on good things to do with my mana. I do want the mana accelerant, because casting these cards is going to win me a lot of games, and, if you can cast multiple or just more of them, that's a good place to be. So, again, to show you the deck, this is where I ended up. I ended up not playing the Archfiend, because I ended up being red-green base, but I ended up playing all the other good cards. So, I hope this is helpful. This is a little bit of a shorter video where I didn't go as in-depth as I usually do. So let me know if this is something that you've been experiencing too. Let me know if this is helpful. And once again, let me know if you have any questions about the strategy, anything that I didn't cover. All right, see you later, everybody.